Well, Sean Lang is a senior lecturer in history at Anglia Ruskin University in Cambridge, and he joins us now. Now, it seems strange, but it's worth remembering that there was a lot of doubt about whether the 25-year-old Queen could do the job at the start in 1952.
There was indeed, as indeed there was about her father, who of course became king because of the abdication. Yes, you come in, you've got post-war Britain, you've got austerity, you've got rationing, and it's not an easy time to be in anywhere near the head of the state or the government or whatever. And yes, she did seem very young, very inexperienced, which of course she was, but she had the great advantage at the very start of her reign, of course, of Winston Churchill as her first prime minister, in the sense of someone of enormous charisma, but also experience. And it's not unknown. In fact, queens in particular have, like Queen Victoria and indeed like Queen Elizabeth I, have tended to latch on to a sort of, well, if you like, a sort of father figure. And there was a sense of that in the early days. But again, she was inheriting a monarchy which was very old-fashioned. Her voice was very sort of elevated and rather posh. There were lots of rituals like presenting debutantes at the palace, and a debutante was a young woman of the upper classes, sort of going out into society. All of that has gone, but it was there at the start. It's absolutely right, and I suppose at first people thought that's what the monarchy was going to be, but they were wrong.
Now, she oversaw the leadership of 15 prime ministers, but seemed publicly apolitical. Give us a sense of how much influence she did have on 10 Downing Street and Westminster, because it's so hard to imagine it was the time of Sir Winston Churchill going all the way back then.
Yeah. In terms of the influence, it's not the sort of thing that you see on a screen for the most part. It's behind the scenes. The most obvious is because she has the right under the Constitution, insofar as we have a written one, to be consulted by the Prime Minister. In other words, he has to ask her advice. She can warn him, she can encourage him. And that means that the Prime Minister has to see the Queen every week. And there are no minutes taken of their meetings. So all we have, and because she's never given any hint of what goes on, but you get one or two hints, not in detail, but you do get a sense of it from various prime ministers going back at least to Harold Wilson. And all the consensus is that she's very sharp. She knows her stuff. She reads her the boxes, the government papers very, very thoroughly, sometimes more thoroughly than the Prime Minister has done. She knows exactly the right questions to ask. In the end, constitutionally, she has to accept the decision, the advice of the Prime Minister, but she's in a position to warn him. Now, there have been one or two occasions back in the 60s and 50s and 60s when she was actually quite involved in selecting who would be the Prime Minister before the political parties finally worked out how to choose their leaders. So she's had sort of direct influence in those in that sort of way back in the past, but overwhelmingly both in British politics but also in the Commonwealth, she's got that knowledge and that experience to negotiate with people, to mediate, to bring people together in fairly relaxed, non-threatening but very constructive manner. It's almost the epitome of just what can be achieved through diplomacy, influence, all going on behind the scenes and behind the smiles.
Of course, the last Prime Minister she met and shook hands with, Liz Truss, described the Queen as the rock upon which modern Britain was built. How do you think she steered the British monarchy into the 21st century?
We got a nice mixed metaphor there of a rock steering us. It's a bit of both, though. It's perfectly true. The thing about the rock is that it's permanent and stable, and that's absolutely right. Like many people here, I've been sort of thinking back to the earliest days of my memory, and I can remember a wonderful, beautiful picture of the Queen about the coronation time on the wall of my primary school. She was always there in every conceivable way, from the political and news right the way down to children's books and popular culture and so on. Now, that's the rock side. That's the sort of permanent presence, like a permanent relative. But in terms of steering, there's the steering of the monarchy, but also contributing to the steering of the country in the sense of an example. And I think the key there is, well, two things really. One is change, constant change, while appearing to be the same. So that's the trick, if you like, if you can do it, and she could, to be constantly changing while appearing always to be the same. But the other is the example to people, if you like, that she was one of them, one of us. So this is why the scandals in the royal family that you might have thought might have sort of sunk the monarchy didn't necessarily. It all depended on how she handled them. But after all, which of us has a family which doesn't have serious troubles from time to time? And that idea that, the sort of troubles that she was having to cope with were in their, not necessarily in all their details, but divorces and breakups and all the rest of it. This is all too human for all of us. And that idea that the Queen is both distant but also very close, both far away but also one of us. Again, a tricky balancing act, which she was very good at. And I think that's really where the secret lies in terms of providing that that sense of direction, that sense of unity through some very, very turbulent years while she's been on the throne.
Yes, we all have our family dramas. Now, publicly, Her Majesty kept up her grace and poise throughout the toughest of times across various scandals within the royal family, but also during periods of political instability. Do you think she was regarded as the model of leadership both within the UK and overseas, which people should strive to achieve?
I think it's developed over the course of her reign. In terms of the British people, first of all, I think that's been fairly constant. I mean, there have been different sort of levels of enthusiasm at different times, and after Diana's death, there was a big drop in sort of the positive ratings, as it were. But it didn't take too much for her to get back and to sort of win back the affection. You saw that, for example, with the Golden Jubilee only a few years later. Around the world, I've been listening beforehand, to the reports from India and, of course, from Australia, and that very much illustrates the way in which she is seen, that rather she did with her people in the United Kingdom, that sort of physical presence that which she did around the world, very, very important, I think. But in terms of the sort of way in which she was taken seriously by politicians and in my own profession of historians, I think that's grown. I mean, we were saying at the beginning that in the early days there were sort of she seemed very inexperienced. By now, politicians have recognised just how experienced she is, just how canny she is, and it's interesting to note how historians have now begun to started over the last 10 years or so to take her much more seriously than they used to, and I think that's right.
And she was seen as a symbol both of colonialism while at the same time a symbol of decolonisation in ushering in and maintaining the Commonwealth.
Yes, and indeed you can't have the one without the other. I mean, it's perfectly true that of course she inherited an empire, and for a long time she was ruler of places as colonies, but at the same time decolonising, and that's been the major theme of her reign. Most notably, I suppose, in the 1960s with the big decolonisation in Africa, and of course the handover of power in Hong Kong, and that will continue. The Commonwealth has evolved way away from the idea of a sort of old empire club into a much more forward-looking, much more broad-minded type of international development, and it is sort of environmental issues. It will continue, particularly in the new reign. But that's a process over which she has sort of supervised, and rightly so, because she's always been the idea that countries should follow their own wishes and the wishes of their people. If they want to retain her as the monarch, fine. If they don't, fine. She sort of bows to the wishes of the people, as she has done in her own kingdom.
And Sean, what can we expect from the reign of King Charles III? It's only been 1 day. Will he stamp his own personality characteristics to the monarchy?
Yes, he will. People always do. And a lot of what you get will be what you've already seen. Again, it's always the way. Although I think it is true to say that there have been examples, and a good example is the sort of comparison which would be Queen Victoria's eldest son, who also was Prince of Wales for a very long time before finally becoming king, and really grew into the role very quickly. So we could see that. But I think in general terms, we'll see perhaps as a much more or slightly more sort of courage, I suppose, in speaking out. That's been a mark of him. But equally, notice the things he's spoken out on. It's things like the environment, it's like climate change, things which, of course, are very much of the moment now. To some extent, he was sort of ahead of the rest of us on those.
And Sean, before I let you go, I just wanted to ask you, what are your, I suppose, your personal and favourite memories of the Queen?
I would say, in terms of direct memories, two. One is the Jubilee of 1977, because that's the one when I was a teenager. That's one I tend to have most vivid memories of. And the second has got to be this year in the Platinum Jubilee, that little cameo with Paddington Bear. And I thought that summed up just how the monarchy had changed and grown in people's affection, but also the courage. I don't think many of her predecessors would have dared do something like that. And she had that confidence in her people to be able to do it.
Okay, Sean Lang, really grateful to get your insights. Thank you so much.
Thank you.